Today I'm Brianized. I'm going to talk about the exposure triangle. And to help me do that, we have Briston, Carly, and Derica. And here's their Instagrams if you want to check them all out. These two happen to be actors. Okay, so the first part of the exposure triangle is understanding shutter versus aperture versus ISO, or ISO, depending on how you like to say it. For 35 years, it's been ISO to me. Suddenly it's ISO. I don't get it. But anyway, they all interact with each other. And I call it a triangle because if you put shutter up here and you have aperture here and you have ISO down here, it does make a huge difference in your photographs. Shutter speed will affect movement, whether something's still or shows blur from movement. Aperture shows depth of field, which I'll get to in just a second, and ISO, or ISO, is just how much gain or range the camera has, how much sensitivity it has to the light, okay? First, I want to talk about aperture. So I have Briston here, and we have Carly behind him, and if I was to set the aperture to, let's say f11, and get a correct exposure, and if I was to focus on Briston's face and keep Carly just in the background, she's going to come out pretty sharp, just like the photo you see on the screen. But if I drop the aperture down to f1.8 and adjust my shutter to get a correct exposure and do the same shot, Carly's a complete blur, and you can't even tell who that is back there. It could be anybody with black straight hair. That's how aperture works. That's depth of field. You'll hear people say, I want very little depth of field, or I want a lot of depth of field. They use the term incorrectly. If you want this in focus all the way back to here, that's a lot of depth of field, not a little depth of field. A little depth of field would be like just from his eyeball to his ear is in focus. Everything else is blurry. That's shallow depth of field. A lot of people get the terms used wrong. So for the next one, what I'm going to do is show you how the effect of shutter speed has on movement in a photo. Let me have you guys start over pretty much on the handicapped sign there, and you're just going to walk this way. Go ahead and start walking. Yep. Perfect. Thanks, guys. And then come on back over here. Now we're going to do it again, but this time I'm going to drop it back down to a really, really fast shutter speed. And let me adjust my aperture all the way down to f1.8 here. And that puts me to about a 500th of a second shutter. A little faster. We're losing some light now. Okay, guys, go ahead and walk for me. Okay, thank you so much. Come on back to the center here. That's the basics of the shutter versus aperture. In other words, the faster your shutter, the more likely you are to freeze motion. The slower your shutter, the more likely you are to not freeze, and they're actually going to cause some blur, as shown in the photos. Now, the third one that's a little bit harder to show you here is actually ISO. I'm going to try. Let me just take a section of a photo here at 100 ISO, which is the lowest best my camera goes to, and they're just going to stand there and look at me. They're probably getting bored of that by now. Right now, I'm at 1/250th of a second, f1.8 at 100 ISO. And that's what you get from that. Now, I have to crank up the aperture in order to be able to use a higher ISO because it's kind of bright out here still. So I'm going to crank up that ISO to, let's try to get it to like really high. Let's go to 25,000 ISO. 20,000 ISO, that works. That's as much as I'm going to be able to get out here. And I'm going to take another photo. You can see the difference in the grain from the one on the left to the one on the right. The one on the right is the 20,000 ISO. The one on the left is the 100 ISO. Basically, you want to keep your ISO as low as you possibly can while getting the depth of field that you can get using the aperture that you want to use while keeping a shutter speed that you can handhold unless you want to show motion. I know, that's a mouthful, but that's the way this works. So essentially, good rule of thumb, I'm using a 55mm lens. In order to handhold this successfully on a non-moving subject, I have to be at about a 50th to a 60th of a second. Anything slower than that, and I risk movement of the camera. Now, if they're moving, you want it a lot faster, usually 1/200th of a second or faster for a 50mm lens, okay? It's not a hard and fast rule, but a lot of it, you'll get used to it over time. How much depth of field do you want? your choice. If you want something to be really shallow, you want a smaller number. If you want something to be, you want everything from here all the way to there or further in focus, you want a much larger number. That actually signifies the size of the aperture or the hole in the lens. If you look down, the blades of the lens, the smaller that hole, the larger your depth of field. The larger that hole, the more light it lets in, but the shallower your depth of field. Did you ever play with a pinhole camera when you were a kid? You know, you had a box, you just poked a hole in it and you looked through and everything was in focus. That's why, it's because it's a really, really tiny hole. That's the way that works. I want to show you a few shots, basically adjusting one aspect of the exposure triangle in each shot to maintain the same exposure across 3 different photos, but using different settings. So first shot, I'm at 2/50th of a second, f1.8, ISO 100. Okay? Now, if I wanted to have a slower shutter speed for whatever reason, say I take that down a full stop, let's go 2 full stops. That brings me down to a 60th of a second. To make up for that, since my ISO is already at 100, I have to raise my aperture by 2 stops, which puts me to f3.5. Now I take that same photo, same exposure, but different settings because we have a slower shutter and we have a higher aperture, therefore we have more depth of field. Now, if I wanted, for whatever reason, to be able to use a higher ISO, say I wanted my ISO to be at 200, let's go to 400 even, 2 stops up. That means I can drop my shutter speed or I can raise my aperture, okay? If I drop my shutter speed 2 stops, I'm down into non-hand-holdable territory, so I have to change my aperture. And that brings me to f7.1. So now I'm at a 60th of a second, f7.1, ISO 400. Thank you guys for being so cooperative. I know it's not fun to just stand there in front of a camera for no reason. So by doing that, I maintained the same exposure, but I gave it a lot more depth of field and kept my shutter speed at a 60th of a second. And that's the basics of the exposure triangle. A lot of it's experimentation. You get used to using it over time. And basically, if you don't understand it, be very, very careful when you're using anything but an auto mode on your camera. If you go to manual mode on your camera and you don't understand this, you're gonna be doing a lot of trial and error, making a lot of mistakes. Learn how to shoot manual, then you can actually shoot aperture priority, shutter priority, even program mode on your camera. It's better if you actually understand how it works first. That's all I got. Thanks for watching, guys. Have a good one.